On the 8th of November, 1519, a few hundred Spaniards walked out onto a stone road that ran straight across a lake toward the largest city in the Americas. A few hundred of them. Ahead, a city of perhaps 250,000 people. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, rose out of the water, bigger than any city most of them had ever seen, bigger than any city in Spain. And walking with them that morning were thousands of warriors who were not Spanish at all. One of the soldiers, writing it down many years later, said the sight was like the enchantments in a storybook. He said that some of the men, looking at the city floating on the lake, asked one another whether what they were seeing was a dream. These were hard men. They had no other word for it. Ahead of them, across the water, the most powerful man in the Americas was waiting to meet them. And almost everything you have been told about what happened next is the version the winners chose to write. Start with the thing the school book leaves out, because it is the first thing you would have seen. The Spaniards did not arrive at the lake alone. By the time they reached this causeway, thousands of indigenous warriors were marching with them. Not as servants, not as porters, but as an army, with its own banners and its own captains, walking toward the capital of an empire many of them had hated their whole lives. Over the months that followed, that number would grow into the tens of thousands. At the siege that ended this story, the people fighting alongside the Spaniards would outnumber them by something like 100 to 1. That is the question the whole story turns on. Where did these warriors come from? And why were they helping a few hundred foreigners walk into the heart of the Aztec world? The man at the front was named Hernán Cortes. He was about 34 years old, and if you went looking, in his life before this, for the soldier of legend, the brilliant general, the master of war, you would not find him in the record. He had been a notary, a man who drew up legal documents, then a landholder on the Spanish island of Cuba, and twice the mayor of a small colonial town there. He had, as far as any surviving document shows, never commanded an army in his life. There is even a story, often repeated, that he studied law at one of the great Spanish universities. He did not. He had a couple of years of private Latin tutoring as a boy and dropped it. The grand education, like so much else, was added later to make the man fit the legend. What he did have was an unusual gift for one thing, not fighting, paper. The expedition he was leading was, strictly speaking, illegal. He had sailed from Cuba in open defiance of the governor's order to arrest him, and that made him, in the eyes of Spanish law, a mutineer leading stolen men and stolen ships. His answer to that problem was not a sword, it was a legal document. On the coast, a few months before, he had founded a town that barely existed, a few buildings and a name on the beach. He had his own men sit as the town council of this paper town, and the council then formally appointed Cortes its commander, answerable, it claimed, directly to the King of Spain and to no one else. He had taken a mutiny and turned it, on paper, into a lawful command granted by a legitimate town. The petition that council sent to the king is the earliest surviving document of the whole conquest. That is who was at the head of the column. Not a general, a clever, literate, well-financed colonial operator with nerve, walking into a war he had not started and would never fully control. And he could not even speak to the people whose world he was walking into. Almost everything Cortes would say to the rulers of this empire, and everything they would say back, had to pass through two other people first. One was a Spaniard named Aguilar. He had been shipwrecked on the Maya coast 8 years earlier, and had survived in captivity by learning the Maya language. The Spaniards had found him there on the way in, a European who could suddenly speak to the people of the coast. But Maya was not the language of the empire on the lake. The second person closed the gap. She was a young woman, probably still in her teens. The Spaniards baptized her and called her Marina. Her name, in her own language, was Malintzin. She had been born into the Nahuatl-speaking world of the empire, sold or given away into the Maya-speaking lands of the coast as a girl, and so she had grown up holding both languages at once. After a battle near the coast, she was among 20 enslaved women handed to the Spaniards as a gift. And in that moment, the chain was complete. Cortes spoke Spanish to Aguilar. Aguilar spoke Maya to Malintzin, and Malintzin spoke Nahuatl to the most powerful men in Mexico, and carried their answers back along the same chain. Every demand, every threat, every promise that decided the fate of this empire passed through the mouth of an enslaved teenage girl. She is one of the very few people who is present for this entire story, from the first landing on the coast to the last day of the siege. The Spaniards' accounts mostly push her to the edge of the picture, but the indigenous allies, when they drew their own version of the war, put her right at the centre of it, standing between the two worlds, because they understood that without her there was no conversation at all, and without the conversation there was no alliance, and without the alliance there was no war. Later Mexican histories would brand her a traitor, the woman who sold her people. But there was no Mexico yet to betray, and no nation she belonged to. She was an enslaved girl who had been given away twice before she ever met a Spaniard, holding the one skill that made her indispensable to everyone and safe with no one. We do not know most of what she chose to soften or sharpen or leave out. We only know that the empire's fate was negotiated in her voice. So this is the picture the morning of the 8th of November actually held. A small corps of foreigners, led by a lawyer with no army of his own, speaking through a captive woman, at the head of an indigenous host marching toward a city that most of that host had every reason to want broken. The question is not how a few hundred Spaniards conquered an empire. The question is what kind of empire had this many of its own enemies already marching inside it. To understand the war, you have to understand the place. Tenochtitlan was a city built on water. The people who built it called themselves the Mexica, and I will come back to that word, because the name Aztec, you already know, is itself part of the story we got wrong. The Mexica had founded this city nearly 200 years earlier on a marshy island in the middle of a shallow lake, and over those 2 centuries they had turned the lake itself into the body of the city. They built floating gardens, rectangles of mud and reed staked out in the shallows and anchored to the lake bed, so fertile they could be harvested again and again across a single year. They fed the city. They built 3 great causeways out to the mainland, each one carrying a road wide enough to march a column across, and each one was cut at intervals by wooden bridges that could be lifted away. Lift the bridges, and the road broke into a string of islands. The city could seal itself off from the land whenever it chose. They built a long earthen dike right across the lake to hold back the salty eastern water and keep the city ringed in fresh. And they ran an aqueduct in from a spring on a wooded hill at the water's edge, carrying clean drinking water all the way across the lake to the island. Every one of those systems either fed the city or defended it, and every one of them was something that a war, one day, might be able to cut. That is not a detail, it is the ending of this story, hidden in plain sight at the beginning. To the Spaniards, the scale of it was almost unbelievable, and the numbers they reached for cannot really be checked. How many people lived here is one of the things we genuinely cannot pin down. The honest answer is a wide range, somewhere between roughly 50,000 and 250,000, and scholars still disagree about where in that range the truth sits. But on almost any count, it was larger than any city the Spaniards had ever lived in, larger than Seville, larger than any city in Spain. There was a market in the city's twin district that one of the Spaniards described as twice the size of the Great Square at home, with tens of thousands of people buying and selling in it on a single day. There was a temple precinct at the centre, with a pyramid that rose in two great shrines above the rooftops. There was running order to the place, a clean grid of canals and walkways that astonished men who had come from the cramped, filthy cities of their own world. But this empire was not a single country the way we picture one. It was something stranger and more fragile. It was a tribute machine. When the Mexica and their two allied cities conquered a people, they usually did not occupy them. They did not replace the local king. They did not settle the land with soldiers or govern it day to day. They left the defeated ruler sitting on his throne, left his warriors armed, left his city standing. And they demanded that he send tribute: cloth, feathers, food, gold, war captives, on a fixed schedule forever. The whole arrangement was held together not by occupation, but by fear, by the certain knowledge that if the tribute ever stopped, an army would come and make an example of you. So there were almost no garrisons holding the tributary provinces down. The empire did not need them, as long as the fear held. But look at what that actually meant. Across the whole reach of Aztec power, there were dozens of conquered kings still sitting on their thrones, still commanding their own armies, still remembering with perfect clarity exactly who had humiliated them, burned their temples, and dragged their sons up the steps of a pyramid. One historian put it as plainly as it can be put. Mexico, he wrote, was conquered not from abroad, but from within. An empire that rules by fear leaves its own executioners alive inside it. When a credible enemy finally arrived, they were already there, armed and waiting. There is one more thing to say about this city before we follow the war, because it shapes everything that comes after. Almost every image you will ever see of this story, and very nearly every sentence anyone can tell you about it, was made after the city had already fallen. The drawings were made by survivors decades later, remembering through grief, or by the indigenous allies who won, drawing their own version of the war the way they wanted it remembered, or by the Spaniards who took the credit and needed the story to flatter them. There is no neutral witness here. There is no camera. When we ask what happened inside Tenochtitlan, we are always reading somebody's account, set down by somebody with a reason to shape it. So the most honest version of this story is not the one that sounds the most certain. It is the one that tells you, plainly, where the holes are. I am going to tell you where the holes are, and start with the simplest one, right at the root. These people did not call themselves Aztecs. They called themselves the Mexica. The word Aztec came into wide use centuries after the city fell, coined by a European scholar and spread by historians who never set foot in the place. No subject of the emperor would have answered to it. So from here on, when I mean the people, I will call them the Mexica. I will keep Aztec Empire only as the name you already know it by. To see how the empire came apart, you have to go back a few months, to the coast. In the summer of 1519, before any of them had seen the great city on the lake, the Spaniards landed in the country of the Totonacs, and they came to a town the chronicles describe as white-walled and prosperous, the seat of a heavy-set local lord the Spaniards remembered for his size. It was a wealthy place. It was also a deeply unhappy one. Its people paid tribute to Tenochtitlan, and they hated it. While the Spaniards were guests in the town, officers of the empire arrived, tribute collectors, walking through the streets with the easy arrogance of men who have never once been refused, there to count what was owed and to take, on top of the goods, a number of people for sacrifice. The Totonac lord, the Spaniards noticed, went pale at the sight of them, and Cortes did something small and very deliberate that tells you he understood the empire better than the empire understood him. He talked the Totonacs into doing the one thing no subject people ever dared do. He had them seize the emperor's tribute collectors and bind them. Consider what that actually was. Not a battle, not a rebellion in the field. The Totonacs simply arrested the empire's taxmen and stopped paying. And it was the single most dangerous thing they could possibly have done, because the whole machine ran on the certainty that no one, ever, would dare. The fear was the structure. Lay a hand on the tribute collectors, and you have announced that the fear is broken. And then Cortes did something cleverer still, and colder. In secret, by night, he had 2 of the captured collectors set free and sent back to the emperor with a private message, that he, the foreign captain, had protected them from the rebels and meant the emperor no harm. So, to the Totonacs, Cortes was the man who had finally broken the empire's grip and stood with them. And to the emperor, at the very same moment, Cortes was the man who had restrained the rebels and shown his good faith. He was playing both sides of a crack that he himself had just widened, and being thanked by both. It worked better than he could have planned. Around 30 Totonac towns flipped, stopped paying, threw their warriors and their porters in with the strangers, and gave Cortes his first real foothold of allies before he had fought a single battle for the capital. The empire's first loss in this war was not a city, and it was not a battle. It was a shipment of tribute that never arrived. The first crack was not military, it was fiscal, and it opened the instant a frightened people realized the punishment they had dreaded their whole lives might not be coming. There is a famous image attached to this stretch of the story, and it shows in miniature exactly how the whole legend got built. You have almost certainly heard that Cortes burned his ships, that he set fire to his own fleet on the beach so that his men could not turn back, a grand, theatrical gesture of no retreat. He did no such thing. In his own letter to the king, written the next year, he says he had the ships run aground and taken apart, on the pretext that they were no longer fit to sail. He stripped them for hardware, for the nails and the iron and the rigging he would need inland, and beached the empty hulls. Centuries later, divers searching the harbour found anchors of the right age and origin resting on the sea floor. They did not find burned wrecks. The fire was added later by storytellers, generations afterward, because he burned his boats behind him makes a far better legend than he beached them and pulled out the nails. That tiny embroidery, turning a quartermaster's cost-saving decision into an act of heroic, bridge-burning will, is the whole myth of this conquest in a single image. A practical man's careful choices retold as the boldness of a hero. Watch for it. It happens again and again and again. Now we can answer the question from the causeway. Where did the army come from? In September of 1519, marching inland toward the great city, the Spaniards came to the country of Tlaxcala. And Tlaxcala is the hinge on which this entire war turns. Tlaxcala was a confederation of 4 allied towns, about 100 kilometers east of the lake. And it was the great exception, the one neighbor the empire had surrounded, pressed, and fought for generations, and had never managed to conquer. The Mexica had ringed it in, cut its trade, and sent army after army against it across the years, and Tlaxcala had refused, every time, to be swallowed. These were people who had spent their entire history living next to the most powerful state in the Americas, hating it and surviving it. They did not welcome the strangers. They fought them, and they fought them hard. A young Tlaxcalan war leader threw army after army at the Spaniards across nearly 2 weeks, in the most dangerous fighting the Spaniards had yet faced. By their own frightened accounts, a few more days of it, and there might have been no Spaniards left alive to write anything down at all. The legend of the unstoppable conquistadors very nearly ended here, on a dry hillside, at the hands of the one people the empire could not beat either. And then the elders of Tlaxcala made a decision that changed the history of the world. They stopped fighting the strangers, and they took them in. Not because they were tricked, not because they mistook the foreigners for gods. They joined them for one cold, clear reason, the same reason the whole war runs on. These strangers were enemies of Tenochtitlan, and Tlaxcala had been waiting its entire existence for an enemy of Tenochtitlan that might actually be worth backing. This is the part of the story the legend simply cannot hold. The Tlaxcalans were not Cortes's pawns. They were not his dupes, and they were not his victims. They were a free people fighting their own century-old war on their own terms against an empire they meant to bring down. The Spaniards did not recruit a band of native auxiliaries. It was closer to the reverse. The Tlaxcalans absorbed a few hundred well-armed, useful foreigners into a fight they had been waging since before any of those foreigners were born. And we do not have to guess at how they saw it, because they told us. The Tlaxcalans drew their own war in a great painted history, and in their version they are not in the background holding the Spaniards' spare weapons. They are at the center of the fighting, where they knew they belonged. The version in which a handful of Spaniards did all of this is the version the Spaniards drew. The people who did most of the actual fighting drew a very different picture, and theirs has every reason to be closer to the truth. Even here, though, the holes are worth naming, because the grievances get sharpened in the retelling, just like everything else. Tlaxcala remembered the empire's pressure as a perfect, suffocating siege. No salt, no cotton, the noose drawn tight for years. The grievance was real, and the pressure was real. But when archaeologists looked at what actually moved through Tlaxcala in those years, they found the blockade leakier than the story says. Goods from the empire's own heartland, including the volcanic glass they made their blades from, kept flowing in at close to normal levels. The hatred was true. The airtight version of it was a little truer to the feeling than to the fact. The combined army marched on toward the lake. And on the road, at a temple city called Cholula, something terrible happened. A massacre in the streets, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people killed in the space of a few hours. Every account of that day contradicts the next. The death toll runs from a few thousand up to figures that are almost certainly invented. Cortes claimed the people of Cholula were preparing to ambush his army, and that he struck first. Others said the dead were unarmed, lured into a courtyard and cut down. The one thing the sources agree on is the part that fits the war least comfortably. The killing was carried out, in large part, not by Spaniards at all, but by Tlaxcalan warriors, settling their own old scores against a neighbouring people they had hated for generations. What actually set it off, under all the versions, we can no longer reach. That is the shape of this whole war, and it does not get cleaner from here. There is no side in this story without blood on its hands. The empire had made these enemies itself, one conquest at a time, one tribute of captives at a time. And now those enemies were walking toward its capital, together with the strangers, to finish what the empire had started. Which brings us back to the causeway and the 8th of November, where we began. The emperor came out to meet them in person. Moctezuma, the most powerful man in the Americas, came out onto the causeway, carried in state, under a canopy, his lords sweeping the road before his feet, so they would not touch the ground. And the two men met there, on the stone road above the water. Gifts passed between them, necklaces of gold and worked flowers. When Cortes moved to embrace the emperor, the lords around him reached out and stopped the Spaniards' arms. You did not lay hands on this man. And here we have to take apart the second great character of the legend, because the schoolbook gets him as wrong as it gets the conquerors. The schoolbook, Moctezuma, is a broken man before the story even starts. A superstitious mystic, paralyzed by omens and bad dreams, convinced that the bearded strangers are returning gods, who simply freezes and hands over his empire without a fight. Almost none of that survives contact with the earliest evidence. The Moctezuma in the oldest sources is close to the opposite kind of man. He ran something very like an intelligence service. He had received reports of strange ships on the distant coast more than a year before the Spaniards arrived, and had sent watchers down to observe and report back. He was a hard, calculating ruler, who had spent 2 decades pulling the empire tighter around the capital and destroying his rivals inside it. His careful, watchful response to the Spaniards reads far less like a trance and far more like politics. A powerful man taking the exact measure of an unfamiliar threat and deciding for now that the wisest thing was to bring it inside the city where he could keep his eyes on it. Now, this cuts both ways, and the honest version has to hold both. We should not lurch to the opposite extreme and pretend the Mexica felt nothing, that no strangeness at all had walked into their world. Something genuinely unfamiliar had. But unease is not paralysis, and a watchful king studying a threat is not a mystic kneeling to a god. And then comes one of the strangest gaps in the entire story, a hole right in the middle of the legend's most famous scene. For about 235 days, roughly 8 months, the Spaniards lived inside Tenochtitlan, in the heart of the empire, guests and intruders at the same time. And the famous version of those months is simple and dramatic. Moctezuma was a prisoner. Cortes had seized the emperor, held him under guard in his own palace, and ruled the entire empire through him, like a hand inside a puppet. The trouble is that there is almost no evidence for it. In Cortes's own letters, written about those very months, the supposed prisoner keeps right on receiving foreign ambassadors, keeps collecting tribute from across the empire, keeps moving through the city with a retinue of thousands. Nowhere is there a paper trail of a captured emperor signing away his power. Nowhere is there a record of the Spaniards, this tiny band inside a city of tens of thousands, actually governing anything at all. Scholars who have gone looking for the moment of capture cannot even agree that it happened. Some think Moctezuma was truly a prisoner. Some think he was genuinely seized, but kept his composure and most of his real power. And some think there was no captivity in the way the legend means it, that he was a careful king who chose to keep his dangerous guests close and let them flatter themselves that they were the ones in charge. What actually happened inside that palace across those 8 months, we genuinely cannot say. And the most honest thing this story can do is to leave that silence standing open, rather than fill it with a confident scene that no one ever recorded. The silence ended in blood. In May of 1520, Cortes was away from the city. He had gone back to the coast to deal with yet another problem of his own making, a Spanish force sent from Cuba to finally arrest him. He left the city in the hands of his deputy, a hard, golden-haired captain named Alvarado. And during a great religious festival, with the nobility of the city gathered in the sacred precinct, dancing, in their finery and unarmed, Alvarado had the gates sealed and ordered his men to kill them where they stood. We do not know exactly how many died. The accounts run from several hundred up into the thousands. We do not fully know why Alvarado did it. Afterward, he claimed he had struck first to stop a planned uprising against the Spaniards. But no evidence for any such plot was ever found. And even his own fellow Spaniards, even men who had stood beside him for years, judged him harshly for what he had done. What we do know is what it ended. Whatever those 8 months in the palace had really been, captivity or a wary truce or something that has no clean name, they ended in that courtyard, on those bloodied stones. After the festival, there was no version of this story left that ended quietly. The city rose. And here the legend runs straight into the one fact it has no good answer for at all, because at this point in the story, the Mexica win. With the city in open war, the Spaniards found themselves trapped deep inside it, on an island, with the bridges lifted and the causeways cut. The Emperor Moctezuma was dead by now. The Spaniards said his own people stoned him when he was pushed out to calm the crowd, and that he died of the wounds. The Mexica said the Spaniards killed him themselves once he was no longer of any use to them, and threw the body out by the water. Both sides had every reason to tell it exactly the way they told it. The Spanish version clears Spanish hands, the Mexica version clears the people of killing their own king, and the truth did not survive either of them. A new king, Tlaxcala, took command of the Mexica, and he did the one thing no one in the legend is supposed to be able to do. He drove the foreigners out. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, the Spaniards tried to slip out of the city in the dark, along one of the causeways, carrying as much looted gold as each man could lift. They were spotted. The Mexica came at them from the water on both sides, in war canoes, and the quiet escape turned into a slaughter strung out along the road. Men loaded down with stolen gold went off the edge into the lake and did not come back up. The Spaniards lost a great part of their force that night, dead or drowned or captured. They called it afterward the Night of Sorrows. The empire had met the invader in open war and beaten him. If this story were really about Spanish steel and Spanish genius, it would end right here, in the water, in the dark. And one more legend drowns on that causeway, so let me pull it out of the water before we go on. People still say that Moctezuma's lost treasure lies somewhere at the bottom of the lake, dropped by the fleeing Spaniards, waiting to be found. It does not. The Mexica recovered much of that gold the very next morning, from the shallows and from the bodies. What the Spaniards managed to carry off, in the end, went into furnaces and was shipped to Europe as plain bullion, some of it captured by pirates on the way. Of all the worked treasure of this city, archaeologists have firmly identified exactly one surviving piece. A single bar of gold, about the weight of a small dog, dug up from the old escape route and now sitting in a museum. That is what is left of it. Here the story runs into the part that is most often told wrong, and the truth of it is stranger and more interesting than the legend. In the autumn of 1520, smallpox reached central Mexico, carried in along the same coast and the same roads the Spaniards had opened. It was a disease no one here had ever met before, and against a brand new disease, a population that has never encountered it has almost no defense at all. It moved through the towns and the cities, and it killed on a scale that is genuinely hard to take in. The estimates of how many died run from something like a quarter to a half of the entire population of central Mexico. Pick a number anywhere in that range, and it is a catastrophe. The gap between the low end and the high end is itself most of a city. But the legend gets one thing badly wrong about it. The disease did not single out the Mexica. It did not target the enemy city and spare the Spaniards' friends. It hit everyone. In fact, it arrived first not in the enemy capital at all, but out on the Allied coast, among the Spaniards' own allies. And it killed Allied leaders, Tlaxcalan lords among them, just as surely and just as indifferently as it killed inside the city on the lake. So the smallpox did not tip the war by killing more Mexica than allies. It killed on every side of it. Its one decisive effect was not in how many it killed. It was in exactly who it killed, and exactly when. Cuitlahuac, the king who had just driven the Spaniards out of the city, the one Mexica leader who had met them in open war and beaten them, caught the disease and died of it. He had ruled for about 80 days. Set those two facts beside each other and let them sit. The empire had just found the one man who could beat the invaders, and within weeks, before the real siege had even begun, that man was dead. Not killed in battle, not outmaneuvered by some Spanish stroke of genius, just gone to a disease at the precise moment the Mexica needed him most. The disease did not kill more of them than of their enemies. It killed the right man at the worst possible time. And the gap it tore open is what shaped everything that came next. With Cuitlahuac dead, the crown passed to Cuauhtémoc, a king who was perhaps 18 to 25 years old, taking command of a city already at war and now leading it into the worst of it. The one leader who had beaten the Spaniards in the field was gone, and the Mexica went into the coming siege with their command broken at the exact moment they could least afford it. And there was a decision on the other side, made months earlier, before the disease ever reached the lake, that mattered every bit as much. The battered Spanish survivors of that night on the causeway had limped back to Tlaxcala. Beaten, a fraction of the force that had marched in, a defeated band of foreigners taking shelter with an ally that could have ended them with a single word. And Tlaxcala had a choice to make for the second time. They could hand the strangers over to the empire, they could kill them where they lay, or they could simply turn them out into the open country and the whole invasion would be over. They chose, again, to keep the alliance. And so the single most important decision in the fall of the Aztec Empire was not made by any Spaniard. It was made by a council of indigenous elders, looking down at a defeated, half-dead guest and deciding that the war against Tenochtitlan was still worth winning. So as the new year turned, the Mexica faced a city with broken command and an enemy coalition that had just chosen deliberately to hold together and fight on. And into that opening, in the early months of 1521, the empire's own core began to come apart. Texcoco was the empire's second city, one of the three great cities of the alliance that sat at its very heart. With the king on the lake dead of the disease and command in the hands of a boy, the alliance had never been weaker at its centre. And a prince of Texcoco named Ixtlilxochitl had been waiting. He had been passed over years before, when Moctezuma forced a rival onto the Texcocan throne to keep the city loyal. Now he brought his armies and his city over to the besiegers. The Triple Alliance that ruled the lake was suddenly at war with itself, its second largest city changing sides in the middle of the fight. And that fracture, like all the others, was the empire's own making. The crack had been cut by Moctezuma's own hand to tighten his grip years before any Spaniard set foot on the coast. So the coalition that now closed on the city was not the broken band that had fled the causeway. With Texcoco's warriors thrown in beside Tlaxcala's, the host besieging Tenochtitlan had swelled into the tens of thousands, larger than anything Cortes had ever led. And it was that swollen indigenous coalition, not a few hundred foreigners, that was about to build the thing that finished the city. And this is the moment the legend most wants to hand to Cortes, and Cortes alone. It is the moment that belongs to him least. The Spaniards had learned, at terrible cost on that night on the causeway, that they could not take an island city by marching down narrow stone roads into the teeth of war canoes. So they decided to build their own ships. 13 of them, small, fast warships to seize control of the lake itself. The problem was that the safe ground where they could build was 100 kilometers from the water, on the far side of a mountain range. So the ships were built in pieces in Tlaxcala, in the high country, nowhere near a lake. And then they were carried, taken apart again, plank by plank, and beam by beam, and nail by nail, and hauled over the mountains on the backs of thousands of indigenous labourers, down to the lake's edge, and reassembled there on the shore. To get them off the dry ground and onto the water, Cortes himself wrote that more than 8,000 people worked for 50 straight days digging a great canal to float them out. That is the Spanish Navy that won this war. It was designed by a Spaniard, yes. It was built, taken apart, carried over a mountain range, dug a channel for, and floated into battle by the empire's indigenous enemies. Like very nearly everything else in this war, the decisive instrument was indigenous hands, doing the overwhelming share of the work in service of an indigenous war. And once those ships were on the lake, everything the city had been built to be turned against it. The Spaniards cut the aqueduct, the one bringing fresh water in from the spring on the wooded hill. And now the city sat in the middle of an entire lake of water it could not drink, because the water all around it, on that side of the great dike, was brackish and salt. Then they put the warships on the water, broke the canoe fleets that had always controlled it, and began taking the causeways, one lifted bridge at a time. And every single defense that had made this island the safest city in the Americas became the thing that trapped it. The causeways that could be sealed against any enemy on land were no defense at all against an enemy who now owned the water. The lake that had been a perfect moat became a wall around a cage. The water that had fed the city now starved it. Cortes himself understood exactly what had done it, and said so plainly. The ships, he wrote to his king, were the key of the whole war. The lake had defended this city for 200 years. It took about 3 months to turn it into the thing the Mexica could not get past. But do not for a moment mistake any of this for a people giving up. The Mexica fought for their city street by street and canal by canal. And at the end of June, with the siege already closing around them, they won one more great victory. A Spanish assault pushed too far, too fast into the broken streets and collapsed. The Mexica counterattacked, broke it, and Cortes was nearly captured alive in the rout, saved only, by the accounts, because one of his own men died, dragging him free of the hands that had hold of him. And the Mexica took dozens of Spaniards alive. Over the days that followed, the Spaniards and their allies out on the causeways could see, across the water, their captured comrades, led up the steps of the great temple in plain view, and sacrificed there, one after another, at the top. One of the Spanish soldiers wrote about it many years afterward, about watching his friends carried up the pyramid where everyone below could see them, and knowing every single day that any morning it might be his turn. I am not going to dwell on what was done up there at the top of the steps. The dread of this beat is not in the detail of it. The dread is in the men standing at the bottom of the lake's edge, watching and counting and waiting their turn. The Mexica were not passive. They did not feel doomed from the inside. They were still winning in moments, right to the very end. In the end, it was not enough. But it was never, at any point, a surrender. The end came slowly, by water and by hunger. With the lake closed and the aqueduct cut, the city starved. The earliest account we have from inside, written by Nahua survivors only a few years after, reads like a lament. They wrote of broken weapons in the roads, of tearing their hair in grief, of chewing dry twigs and grass, of filling their mouths with dust and bits of mud, of eating lizards and worms. The city that had been the wonder of the Americas was eating its own walls. They held out anyway. Block by block, canal by canal, deep into August, behind the young king Cuauhtémoc. He had come to the throne barely more than a boy, no one is sure of his exact age, and he had defended the city down to the last few streets that were left to defend. He is not the doomed mystic of the legend either. He is something simpler and harder to look away from. A very young man holding the last corner of a dying city long after any rational hope of saving it was gone. On the 13th of August, 1521, with the city all but gone, Cuauhtémoc was taken on the water, trying to slip away by canoe, and with his capture, the resistance ended and the city fell. The siege had lasted somewhere between 75 and 93 days, depending on which day you call the beginning. How many people died in that siege, we cannot say with any honesty at all. The counts run from something like 100,000 into the hundreds of thousands at the softest, highest end. And the wide gap between those numbers is not a detail to hurry past. It is the story. Every count we have was made by someone with a reason to make it bigger or smaller. And the true number is buried somewhere inside a disagreement we can no longer settle. And the gold the whole legend turns on, the fabulous treasure of the conquered empire, it was mostly gone. What the furnaces produced after the fall was a fraction of what the Spaniards had dreamed of, and they could not believe it. So they tortured the captured young king, burning his feet with Cortes's own consent to make him reveal where the rest of it was hidden. There was no rest of it. The treasure of the legend, like the genius of its hero, was always smaller than the story needed it to be. As for the man who had walked at the front of the column, Cortes came out of a war he had not started, that he had survived more than he had commanded, and he lived to write the official account of it. His version. The version that would be copied, polished, and embroidered for the next 400 years. The version in which a brilliant captain and a few hundred brave Spaniards toppled a great empire through European genius and European steel. And within about a year, the very same Spanish crown that had once ordered him arrested as a mutineer turned around and named him governor of the land he claimed to have conquered. The mutineer became the law. The man who took the credit was handed the title to match it. It did not take a few hundred foreigners. It took an empire's own enemies, in their tens of thousands, fighting their own old war. It took a disease that killed the right man at the worst possible time. And it took a lake that changed sides. Cortes was there for all of it. He was not the reason for any of it. The empire fell on the 13th of August, 1521. The people did not. That distinction is the whole point of telling this story honestly. The legend collapses the two into one. Empire and people gone together in a single dramatic stroke by a single great man. Neither half of that is true. The state that ruled from the lake was broken, yes, and broken largely by other indigenous people, who had their own long reasons for wanting it gone. But the people of this world did not vanish on that August day. And the language of the city did not die with the city. The conquerors built their own colonial capital directly on top of the ruined one. The great cathedral that still stands at the center of Mexico City today was raised on the buried sacred precinct, built in part out of the very stones of the temple the Spaniards had torn down. And for generations afterward, the place stayed, in large part, an indigenous city. Rebuilt, lived in, and governed at the local level by Nahua people, on the same ground, speaking the same language they always had. The conquest did not erase them. It buried their temple under a church, and the people went on living above it. Somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75 million people still speak Nahuatl today. The language of Tenochtitlan, still alive on the same ground 5 centuries on. By the most recent count, it is the most widely spoken indigenous language in all of Mexico. The people the legend quietly wrote out of their own victory are still here. And the lake is gone. The water that fed the city, that defended it for 200 years, and that finally drowned it. That lake was drained, slowly, over the centuries that followed, by the people who won. Mexico City stands now on its dry bed, and the dry bed is sinking. As the old lake bed compacts under the weight of the modern city, the ground gives way beneath it, in the worst places by as much as 40 or 50 centimeters a year. The city is settling, slowly and unstoppably, into the absence of the water that made it. So this is what is left, where the great city once stood on the lake. The empire fell, the lake is gone, and the people are still here, on the same ground, sinking slowly into a dry bed where the water used to be, still speaking a language older than the empire that fell. Not a triumph, not a tragedy that ended cleanly, just endurance, on ground that will not hold still, 500 years after a few hundred foreigners were said to have done all of this alone. They did not do it alone. The people who did most of it were already here, and so are their descendants.